Willow Creek was a town that seemed to have it all. Quaint streets, friendly neighbors, and an air of safety that blanketed the community like a warm quilt. But underneath this veneer of perfection, darkness lurked, hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. At the edge of this seemingly idyllic town stood the Lawson house, an old, imposing structure that had seen decades of life, love, and tragedy. It was here that Margaret Lawson, a woman of few words and many secrets, lived alone after the sudden and mysterious death of her husband George. Margaret had always been an enigma in Willow Creek. Known for her meticulous housekeeping and her dedication to local charities, she was respected, even admired. But there was something about Margaret, something that made people uneasy. Some said it was the way she always seemed to be watching, as if she knew more than she let on. Others whispered that George's death hadn't been natural, that perhaps Margaret had finally snapped after years of being under his thumb. But these were just rumors, the kind that spread in small towns where everyone knows each other's business. Or so it seemed, until Lisa Carter, a newcomer to Willow Creek, vanished without a trace. Lisa Carter was everything Margaret Lawson was not: young, vibrant, and full of life. She and her husband, Evan, had moved to Willow Creek from the city looking for a quieter, simpler life. They had quickly become a part of the community, their friendliness and enthusiasm endearing them to everyone they met. One crisp autumn evening, Lisa decided to visit Margaret. She had heard the whispers about the old woman, but she didn't believe them. Lisa was the type who saw the good in everyone, and she felt sorry for Margaret, who seemed so lonely after George's death. She baked a pie, apple, Margaret's favorite, and told Evan she'd be back soon. As Lisa made her way up the hill to the Lawson house, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. The house loomed ahead, dark and silent, its windows reflecting the last rays of daylight. Lisa hesitated for a moment, a shiver running down her spine. But then she shook it off and continued up the path. Margaret greeted Lisa at the door, her expression as inscrutable as ever. She accepted the pie with a curt nod and invited Lisa inside. The house was just as Lisa had imagined, neat, orderly, and filled with the smell of old wood and lavender. But there was something else too, an underlying sense of unease, as if the house itself was watching her. Hours passed, and Lisa didn't return home. Evan's concern grew with each passing minute. He tried calling her, but there was no answer. By midnight, his worry had turned to panic. He grabbed his coat and headed up the hill to the Lawson house, the cold night air biting at his skin. When he arrived, the house was dark, with no sign of life inside. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Finally, he tried the door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was silent, the air heavy with the scent of lavender. Evan called out for Lisa, but only his own voice echoed back at him. He searched the downstairs rooms, finding nothing out of the ordinary. But when he reached the kitchen, he noticed something strange. The pie Lisa had brought was still on the counter, untouched. A feeling of dread settled over him as he realized that something was very wrong. The next morning, Willow Creek was abuzz with the news. Lisa Carter was missing. The police were called in, and the search began. Detective Rachel Hayes, a recent transfer from the city, was put in charge of the investigation. Hayes was a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, with a sharp mind and a keen eye for detail. She had come to Willow Creek to escape the pressures of city life. But she quickly realized that this small town had its own brand of darkness. Hayes interviewed Evan first, getting the details of Lisa's last known movements. He told her about the pie, about Lisa's plan to visit Margaret, and about his own visit to the Lawson house later that night. Hayes listened carefully, noting the fear in Evan's voice, the way his hands trembled as he spoke. Next, Hayes went to see Margaret. The old woman answered the door with the same inscrutable expression she had worn the night before. She invited Hayes in, offering her tea, which Hayes politely declined. Margaret's answers were short and to the point. Yes, Lisa had come to visit. No, she hadn't stayed long. Yes, she had seemed fine when she left. But Hayes wasn't satisfied. There was something off about Margaret, something that didn't sit right. As she left the house, she glanced back, catching a glimpse of Margaret watching her from an upstairs window, her eyes cold and unreadable. Hayes decided to dig deeper into Margaret's past. She discovered that George Lawson had been a man of many secrets. On the surface, he had been a respected banker, a pillar of the community. But beneath that facade, he had been involved in several shady deals, many of which had left families in Willow Creek bankrupt and destitute. And then there were the whispers, rumors that George had been abusive, that Margaret had lived in fear of him for years. Hayes also learned about the previous disappearance in Willow Creek. George's secretary, a young woman named Claire, who had vanished without a trace 10 years earlier. The case had gone cold, and no one had ever been charged. But Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that the two cases were connected. As the investigation continued, the tension in Willow Creek grew. The townspeople, once so confident in their safety, began to look over their shoulders, to lock their doors at night, and the whispers about Margaret Lawson grew louder. Evan, consumed by worry and guilt, began to unravel. He spent his days searching for Lisa, driving through the town, questioning anyone who might have seen something. But no one had. Lisa had simply vanished, as if she had never existed. One evening, Evan returned to the Lawson house, his desperation driving him to confront Margaret again. He banged on the door, shouting her name, demanding answers. But Margaret didn't respond. The house remained dark and silent, just as it had the night before. Frustrated, Evan kicked the door, his anger boiling over. He was about to leave when he noticed something, a faint light coming from the basement window. He crouched down, peering inside, and saw Margaret moving around, carrying what looked like a heavy object wrapped in a blanket. Evan's heart raced as he realized what he was seeing. He ran back to his car, grabbed his phone, and called Detective Hayes. Breathless, he told her what he had seen, begging her to come quickly. Hayes arrived minutes later, her siren blaring in the quiet night. She ordered Evan to stay outside as she approached the house, her gun drawn. She knocked on the door, but again, there was no answer. She called for backup and waited, her eyes never leaving the house. When the other officers arrived, they forced their way inside. The house was as silent as before, but this time, Hayes headed straight for the basement. The door was locked, but they broke it down, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The basement was filled with old furniture and boxes, but in the center of the room was a large, freshly dug hole. Beside it lay the object Margaret had been carrying, a body, wrapped in a blanket. Hayes approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knelt down and pulled back the blanket, revealing the lifeless face of Lisa Carter. Margaret was nowhere to be found. With Lisa's body discovered, the investigation took on a new urgency. An autopsy revealed that Lisa had been dead for several days, likely killed the night she had visited Margaret. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, but there were signs of struggle, indicating that Lisa had fought for her life. Hayes was determined to find Margaret and bring her to justice. She put out an APB, and the search began in earnest. But Margaret had vanished, just like Claire had 10 years before. As the police searched for Margaret, Hayes continued to dig into the Lawson family's past. She discovered that George and Margaret had not always lived in Willow Creek. They had moved there shortly after their marriage, but before that, they had lived in another small town, a town where another young woman had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Hayes drove to the town, hoping to find answers. She interviewed the local police, who remembered the case well. The woman, a waitress named Mary, had been dating George before he met Margaret. She had vanished one night, and although George had been a suspect, there had been no evidence to charge him. Hayes also learned that Margaret had been pregnant when she and George moved to Willow Creek. There was no record of the child's birth. When she questioned the doctors who had treated Margaret at the time, they were evasive, unwilling to discuss the details. But one nurse, now retired, agreed to speak with Hayes in private. The nurse revealed that Margaret had given birth to a stillborn baby, a girl. The loss had devastated Margaret, but George had been strangely unaffected. He had refused to allow Margaret to hold the baby, insisting that they bury her quietly, without a funeral or a grave marker. Hayes returned to Willow Creek with more questions than answers. She knew that Margaret was hiding something, but she couldn't put the pieces together. What had happened to the baby? And what connection did it have to Lisa's death? As the days passed, the search for Margaret intensified, but she remained elusive, leaving no trace of her whereabouts. Evan, meanwhile, was spiraling deeper into despair. He blamed himself for Lisa's death, convinced that if he had acted sooner, she might still be alive. One night, Evan received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was soft, almost a whisper. "Meet me at the old mill," the voice said. "I have something you need to see." Evan recognized the voice. It was Margaret. Without telling anyone, he grabbed his coat and headed out, determined to confront her once and for all. The old mill was a crumbling structure on the outskirts of town, long abandoned and forgotten. Evan arrived just after midnight, the moon casting eerie shadows across the decaying walls. He entered the mill, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. Margaret was waiting for him, standing in the center of the room, her expression unreadable. She held a small, weathered box in her hands. "I didn't kill Lisa," Margaret said quietly, "but I know who did." Evan's anger flared. "You expect me to believe that? You were the last person to see her alive." Margaret shook her head. "No, I wasn't. There's someone else, someone who's been hiding in the shadows all these years. George wasn't the only one with secrets." She opened the box, revealing a collection of photographs, old, faded pictures of George with various women, some of whom Evan recognized as the missing women from the files Hayes had shown him. But there was something else, too. A letter written in George's handwriting. It detailed a twisted plan to cover up the murders, a plan that involved more than just Margaret. Before Evan could react, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Detective Hayes, her gun drawn. "Step away from her, Evan," Hayes ordered. "Margaret, you're coming with me." Margaret didn't resist as Hayes handcuffed her. She simply handed the box to Evan, her eyes filled with sadness. "Read the letter," she said. "It will explain everything." As Hayes led Margaret away, Evan opened the letter and began to read. What he saw shocked him to his core. The letter revealed the truth about George Lawson, a truth that had been buried for decades. George had been more than just a murderer. He had been part of a secret society, a group of powerful men who had used their influence to cover up their crimes. The society had connections in high places, and they had used their power to protect George and others like him. But George had grown paranoid, fearing that the society would turn on him. He had started to document everything, keeping detailed records of his crimes and the involvement of others. He had planned to use the information as leverage, but before he could act, he had died under mysterious circumstances. Margaret had discovered the records after George's death, but she had been too afraid to come forward. She knew that if the society found out, they would come after her, so she had kept the secret, hoping that it would die with her. But then Lisa had discovered the truth. She had found the records hidden in the basement and had confronted Margaret, demanding that they go to the police. Margaret had refused, and in the struggle that followed, Lisa had been killed. Not by Margaret, but by one of the society's enforcers, who had been watching Margaret closely. The enforcer had staged Lisa's death to look like one of George's murders, hoping to divert attention from the society. But Margaret had recognized the man. He had been George's closest confidant, someone who had helped cover up the murders all those years ago. Evan was stunned. The truth was more horrifying than he could have imagined, but it also meant that the real killer was still out there, and that Margaret had been a pawn in a much larger game. Armed with the information from the letter, Hayes and Evan returned to Willow Creek, determined to expose the society and bring the real killer to justice. They knew it wouldn't be easy. The society had powerful connections, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. But Hayes was relentless. She began to dig into the backgrounds of the town's most influential figures, looking for any ties to the society. What she found shocked her. Several prominent businessmen, politicians, and even law enforcement officers were involved, all of them complicit in the cover-up of George's crimes. As Hayes prepared to make her move, the society struck back. One night, as she was leaving her office, her car was tampered with, causing it to crash. Hayes survived, but she was hospitalized with serious injuries, leaving Evan to continue the investigation on his own. Desperate, Evan turned to Margaret for help. She was the only one who knew the inner workings of the society, and he needed her knowledge to bring them down. Margaret, realizing that the time had come to atone for her past, agreed to help. Together, they devised a plan to lure the enforcer out into the open. They leaked information about the records to the media, knowing that it would force the society's hand. The plan worked. The enforcer, desperate to retrieve the records, contacted Margaret, demanding a meeting. The meeting was set for a remote location, far from the prying eyes of the media. Evan and Margaret arrived first, hiding in the shadows as they waited for the enforcer to arrive. When he did, Evan confronted him, demanding that he confess to Lisa's murder. The enforcer laughed, taunting Evan, but before he could react, Margaret stepped forward, a gun in her hand. "You ruined my life," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You took everything from me, But it ends tonight. The enforcer tried to flee, but Evan tackled him to the ground. In the struggle, the gun went off and the enforcer was killed. Margaret stood over the body, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." The exposure of the society sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. Several high-profile arrests were made, and the town's most powerful figures were brought to justice. The media descended on the town, eager for every sordid detail, and the Lawson house became a symbol of the town's dark past. Margaret was cleared of Lisa's murder, but she was convicted of aiding and abetting George's crimes. She was sentenced to a long prison term, but she accepted her fate with quiet dignity, knowing that she had finally done the right thing. Evan, though haunted by the loss of Lisa, found some solace in knowing that justice had been served. He continued to live in Willow Creek, working to rebuild his life, but the scars of the past would never fully heal. Detective Hayes, though injured, recovered and returned to duty. She was hailed as a hero, but she remained humble, knowing that the case had taken a toll on her that would last a lifetime. The Lawson house stood empty, its windows boarded up, its secrets finally exposed. But the memory of what had happened there lingered, a dark shadow over Willow Creek. A reminder that even in the most perfect of towns, evil can hide in the most unexpected places.